Welcome to Cinemophile, where we bring you the best in independent, documentary, and foreign films, and we talk to the people who made them. I'm your host, Mike Caspar, and you can find out more about the program by going to cinemaphilepod.com. David Keith knows how to cool the planet fast, but his first tiny experiment has divided environmentalists, spawned a global conspiracy, and inspired rogue geo-engineers. As this disruptive technology lands in a chaotic world in climate meltdown, are any ideas too risky to explore? The film is called Plan C for Civilization, and we are joined today by the director, Ben Kalina. Ben, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Boy, this had me going. My mind was racing during a good part of this film in terms of the science of it, the disruptive kind of ramifications for implementing it, the politics, not only in the world of social politics, but also in the world of academic politics and the environmental movement and such. Really a
hmm
lot going on in this film. So my congratulations on pulling together what is a complex set of issues into a really coherent document for us to take in. Tell me, I know this went back a ways. I know you've been working on this for a while, but what got you started on Plan C for Civilization?
well, thanks, Mike. Yeah, it's an endlessly fascinating subject to me. So I could easily see making films about this for the rest of my life. But this one, I mean, the idea really came after having worked on some other documentaries dealing with climate-related issues, and one in particular that was called A Sea Change, which was about ocean acidification. And on that one, I've met one of the scientists who is in this film a little bit. His name's Ken Caldera. And he is the gentleman who was sort of hosting a meeting about 25 years, 30 years ago, where this idea first got sort of surfaced in the academic community of that time. And so Ken is a lot of things, but one of the things he is a modeler. And at the time when I was working on this film back in like 2007, he was talking about amounts of carbon in the atmosphere and how much the ocean's pH was changing, and how much carbon, if you put it up, would it take to make the ocean so acidic that coral reefs could no longer grow and so forth. And I just remember at the time starting to really think about how I kept hearing about all of these different guardrails or tipping points or levels that we just absolutely had to avoid, and that we'd already started to push past some of them, and that if we continued to just keep moving past them as it seemed like we were, that eventually reality was going to have to hit, and we'd start seeing really dramatic consequences. And around the same time, I also started hearing about this geoengineering idea, or this range of ideas. And Ken actually is someone who's worked a lot on those as well. And I just started realizing that, whether it's reflecting sunlight away from the earth or sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, these are the two big broad categories. Further we went towards just, over the edge, basically, in terms of pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, the more these kind of crazy ideas were going to not be so crazy. And it was really at that time that I started thinking about it and thinking about how is there a way to make a movie about this? Because to me, it was very sci-fi, and it was like, well, if you can kind of imagine these technologies as being real, then you also really have to imagine what happens if we don't make the right choices now, right? And it just took a very long time for that to play out. From that point, it was almost 20 years. But we're now in that world where we have pushed past a number of planetary boundaries, and these ideas are still pretty quiet and in the shadows as far as the public's concerned, but you can see them really starting to gain traction. And so that was the idea all the way back then, and I just kind of hung with it and tried to figure out how to see it unfolding in the real world so that you could actually make a film that was compelling.
I think this would be a good point in our conversation to for the layman's description of what geoengineering is, at least in terms of David Keith's version of geoengineering.
Yeah, so it's a term that lumps together a lot of things, and so I'll just quickly explain one half of it and then dispose of that to some extent. But because David's actually been very involved in both ends of it. One end is about carbon removal, which is basically using a variety of methods to either absorb or suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So that's kind of like reversing what we put up there with, burning fossil fuels. A lot of different ways of talking about that. David started a large company, a company that became large and sold a few years ago. But very separate from that is this idea of essentially like reflecting the sun, sunlight reflection, or solar geoengineering. And that idea is that what this film is about. And that is basically, you can think of it like essentially a way of mimicking certain kinds of volcanic eruptions that when they erupt, spray particles into the stratosphere. Mount Pinatubo is the most recent one that we have on record that's had a significant impact, and that was in 1991 in the Philippines, the eruption put 15 megatons or 17 megatons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, and that those little particles are shiny, and when they get into the stratosphere, they create essentially like a little shroud around the Earth, and they reflect a little bit of sunlight back into space. And that one volcano managed to cool the planet by a full degree Fahrenheit for more than a year. And scientists, since even much earlier than that, have been thinking like, well, observing volcanoes and thinking, is this something that we could do if we ever wanted to get there? If we ever got to the point where we felt like we needed to. And so, really what they've been doing is modeling that because we have the natural analog, we actually have very good observational data, and it's ultimately not that complicated of a thing to do. It's essentially dumping sulfur particles in the stratosphere. So you might need to modify some airplanes to get a little bit higher, but it's certainly not anywhere beyond our capacity technologically. The big questions are what it does, in natural ecosystems, what it does in terms of policy around emissions reductions. If people think there's a quick fix, maybe they stop working so hard to cut emissions. And also, really, the geopolitical side to it is maybe the most like wicked and complex because it would have uneven effects around the world. Some countries might want to do it, others might not. They both might have nuclear weapons. You kind of see where that goes.
Yeah. And if we were a more mature species, I'd have a lot more faith in whatever path we take that would be adapted by most, if not all, of the planet. But just as you described, the geopolitical considerations, sort of the arms race that would take place, who would want to jump ahead and without finding out the long-term ramifications of doing this. That's the part. I mean, there's a couple of huge barriers that this would have to clear to be as
Mhm.
effective as I think David Keith would hope it could be. But man, it's interesting. It's just an interesting idea. By the way, you mentioned the eruption of the volcano. Would you be looking at that level of particles in the air? Is that something that's sort of in the model? If we were going to affect climate at this point, we're going to have a positive impact on climate change. Do you know?
I mean,
Put
is
you on the
that
spot.
volume? Is
Yeah, the
that volume
volume
of
that
particles?
that they were you were talking about the 15 or 17 megatons.
Right.
That
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of the SO2 particles, yeah. I mean, a volcano erupts a lot more than that comes out of it.
right.
So it's not, you wouldn't see a plume like that heading up into the stratosphere. But yeah, I mean, my understanding is that yes, it's roughly, that's what you would put up there. And, there's the possibility. I mean, there are scientists and others talking about kind of, some are even working on custom kind of designed particles that would be even more reflective and would be up in the air for longer, stay aloft longer, and might not have some of the negative health consequences that sulfur dioxide has, which, sulfur dioxide just, is also a pollutant that gets put out when we burn fossil fuels. And so, when we have like air plants, like coal plants and other kinds of plants burning fuel, they put sulfur dioxide up in the lower atmosphere, and in much, much greater concentrations than we would put it up in the upper atmosphere. But the irony here, one of many, is that as we cut back on emissions, which we must do, we're also cutting back on those sulfur dioxide particles in the lower atmosphere. And what we don't sort of think about maybe is that in addition to contributing to global warming, the burning of those fossil fuels also creates this layer of reflective particles that we have right now. And so when we actually cut back on it, we will get a short-term bump, significant bump in heating. And that's one of the rationales that some people like to use for why we might want to offset that with particles in the upper atmosphere, which they claim would require something in the order of either a hundredth or a thousandth of the amount because of putting it in the upper atmosphere. It's much more reflective than down low. But anyways, that's getting into the weeds a little bit, but
No, that's
that's
I know I don't know about our listeners, but I enjoy these kind of conversations because it's something you can, for me, there's real numbers, there's real science, but as is brought up in the film numerous times, and I love the way you approach telling the story. We hear from all points of view, a robust amount of points of view on this technology and its feasibility. But also the two guys, Luke and Andrew, who are in some ways a window into the world we would be going into. Because undoubtedly somebody would see this as the next internet and the next Apple computer and try to get ahead of this thing. And God knows how that could go off the rails in terms of the profit motive that would be in play for them. God knows, because there has to be some managed level of introducing what David Keith is talking about here. It has to be managed. But you
yeah.
get entrepreneurs, Silicon Valley guys out there running around thinking that they're going to be the first in line. That's another whole level of crazy into this all of this things, which you explore in the film. We watch, I'll call them knuckleheads. They're not really. Somebody referred to them in the film as that knuckleheads, but but they're not. But anyway, is that am I characterizing that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, for me in the film, I mean, I think Luke and Andrew are actually, I actually really enjoy them both, and I think
Yeah.
that their hearts are really in the right place. I think that they're provocateurs in a lot of ways and performers, but besides that, they also there is a part of what they're up to, which I think hints at some of the real risks here, which
Yeah.
is the lone actor, the rogue actor, and not necessarily a non-state actor like they are. I think it's unlikely that a billionaire, green finger would be able to actually pull this off or would really want to. That would be a strange
Well,
decision on one's
can I
part.
can I just say they kind of remind me of the Yes Men. Do you remember the Yes Men
Mm,
who would
yes.
prank
Yeah.
big business? They sort of have that element of that in their behavior and in their approach to
Yeah.
all of this.
They do. They're going to be putting on a show at our premiere screenings at the Doc NYC. So, they'll be doing their thing. And they really are. I mean, Luke in particular is, I think, really enjoys kind of, poking people in the nose a little on all sides, and I think that his feeling is I think he represents disruption in a relatively productive and hopefully harmless way, in the sense that he is positing that we should just be doing this, and then let the chips fall where they may. Let's have this conversation instead of, well, actually in his case, let's start doing this and then have a conversation.
Yeah.
I think he's frustrated with all the talk. And I think he's quite aware that the way they're going about it is not the way you would actually do it, and they say that in the film. But really, the question underneath all this is like, when do we stop talking and when do we start acting?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that is really the point. And, as often happens, it's been sort of the caricature of academia. They talk a good game, but it becomes mired in all kinds of probabilities and possibilities and this, that, and the other thing, the politics of higher education and science, that it becomes something that's very difficult to actually implement. And that's where guys like Luke and Andrew, as you're describing them, I almost feel like they're hoping to just have enough of the right idea that someone will have to buy them out and then they'll be on their way. And they'll be sort of kind of hoping because yeah, the depth and breadth of what has to happen is far beyond anything that these guys could be capable of doing. So, That's kind of it's a interesting part of the film because it's a stand-in for rampant runaway capitalism for capitalism's sake.
Yes, and I think I mean Luke and I have had long conversations about capitalism too. So he is not all in on sort of trickle down economics and capitalism in its sort of late stage forms. He's pretty radical himself. But
Yeah.
I think that they're operating within that system, and there's a lot of ways in which it's in which capitalism and marketing and viral media, they've done a really great job of getting attention, and I think that's what they set out to do.
Yeah, they're a very effective part of the story. It adds another dimension. I just want to remind our listeners, speaking with Ben Kalina, he is the director of this documentary film called Plan C for Civilization, and it will be at the Doc NYC 25 Film Festival, and you can see the first screening of it on Thursday, November 13th. That's at the Village East. Also on Saturday the 15th, also at the Village East. And then it'll also be available streaming online through Doc NYC beginning on the 14th through the 30th, which is basically, I think, the run of Doc NYC. By the way, which is, to my mind, the premier festival for documentary films of the year. So congratulations on being a
Thanks.
part of that. There's other dimensions to this film, but first of all, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, David Keith is sincere, well spoken, willing to entertain all kinds of different contradictions in what he wants to do and how he wants to go about doing it, with the idea that it's science. This is the way science works. We need to be figuring it out on the run, and we don't have much time. Is that a good way to put his sort of approach to all of this?
I would say yes. I also hesitate to ever try to characterize
Yeah,
David.
yeah.
David is an incredibly precise and specific, has very specific ideas about how he talks about things, and sometimes it changes how he talks about things, but over time it changes. But
But so does science. Ben, so does science.
absolutely, absolutely. So I just hesitate to ever like speak for him. But yes, I think my impression of David is that he is quite genuine in his desire to solve problems that we have and to do everything he can to figure out how to do that. And that's both in the scientific realm, honestly, and even outside of that too. I mean, the work that he does is not restricted at all to the lab. He does a lot of what he does is spends time basically talking to people and explaining and convincing them of why this is worth researching. He started researching it when it was really career suicide to pursue this idea, and he's been doing it ever since. So,
Well, there's certainly an element of Lord, take this burden from my shoulders in his approach to this. He would just,
mm.
I think from what I heard him say is this is not the technology that we should have ever gotten to the point where we may have to use. We're past cutting back on production. We're past a lot of different options that would have been available 30 years ago. And this is it, I think, again, help me on that.
I'll just speak for myself because
Okay.
David has a very nuanced way of talking about things. But I think this is, I think the way I would put it is that, we've known about this problem for a very, very long time. We've known about the effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a warming agent since, well back to the beginning of the 20th century and even earlier than that. Politically, we've been trying to solve this problem since the mid 90s in earnest, on a global level. Had we started taking the kinds of actions then that we're sort of taking now, had technology been gotten to the point then where it is now, we could have steered ourselves away from the kind of temperature rise trajectory that we are now on. But we didn't. And so we have made tremendous progress, and renewables now are cheaper almost everywhere in the world, either install or operate than any other form of energy. So like we've made huge progress, but the problem is we didn't do it early enough to avoid this kind of temperature rise. And so now we have to entertain ideas that are complex, that involve risk, that are not easy, clean choices. And I mean, people will kind of like find ways to cherry pick data about the energy that's invested in building a solar panel and the resource extraction that goes into it and how it's no better than this, that, or the other thing, which is utter nonsense. But the reality is, that generating energy that provides the kinds of lifestyle that we all have become accustomed to has to come from somewhere. And renewable energy is the place we should be looking. And however, now we're at a point where we have put up so much carbon dioxide. There's 2 trillion tons in the atmosphere that somehow or another have to get taken out because they will stay there for hundreds of years. And beyond that, like we're heating up so quickly, the only lever we have to pull to cool the planet on a, like, say, decades level or even a century level is to reflect sunlight away. And that comes with a lot of baggage. It comes with a lot of problems. So that's a long way of saying that, yeah, I think David more or less would agree with the idea that because of the situation we're in now, the physics of dealing with all this carbon dioxide and heat mean the only way to deal with it is to reflect sunlight. And, that just leaves us with really one option, which is particles in the stratosphere. There are other ways to reflect sunlight. None of them seem clearly as clearly effective as this one.
And one thing about that description, and it comes up in the film quite often, and that is this is this double-edged sword of this technology. And a completely understandable reaction on the part of environmentalists and environmental scientists is that by implementing this, it also allows the continuing of dumping more carbon dioxide into the environment based on quote unquote the success of geoengineering. It becomes a Gordian knot in some ways of not being able to get out from under. I mean, that's the fear. We don't
That's
know
the
if that
fear. Yeah.
we don't know
Yeah.
if that's in real time. We don't know if that'll be the case, but we have seen no propensity or very little propensity on the part of a fossil fuel industry, knowing full well the science that they've known since at least the 50s, probably much earlier, as you described it, much earlier than that, that this was going to happen and
Yeah.
had no
Right.
reliable way of mitigating it, or no desire to mitigate it really, because it's profit margin, right? Isn't that kind of where we're at?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to the tobacco industry, right? I mean, they knew exactly what their products were doing, and they created disinformation to convince us to keep using them. So I don't know which one's worse, or if you can parse them. They're both killing us, like quite literally. They're killing us, and not just us, but everything around us. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's what people call or refer to as the moral hazard,
Moral
in
hazard.
that's sort of philosophical dilemma that people will think there's a quick fix, which is solar geoengineering, and because we're human, we won't think too deeply about the fact that it's actually not a quick fix, and we will say, "Oh, well, thank goodness we can just step off the gas. We don't have to try and worry about cutting emissions so much, right? There's a way to cool the planet." Cooling the planet, there's a lot of reasons why that's not true, right? It's just fundamentally wrong. These are two separate things. If you continue to emit carbon dioxide, and you start to put sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere or whatever you put it in there to cool the planet to reflect sunlight, eventually you're going to get to a state of having so much reflected particles in the stratosphere that if you ever wanted to dial it back, you're going to, by removing that sun shield, the heat that you've built up will just rush back into the system. And so just like a far worse problem than we face right now. People have different ways of thinking about how you would go about doing this, but the idea would never be ever, it would be absolutely psychotic to think that you would just continue to emit carbon dioxide with the idea that you just reflect sunlight away from the earth. I haven't even mentioned, I mean, I did mention very early that I was working on a film about ocean acidification when I learned about this, but solar geoengineering does absolutely nothing for the oceans, which are absorbing something around the range of 90% of the heat that we've generated with our carbon dioxide and 50% of the carbon dioxide itself, which has made them significantly more acidic in the past 100 years, to the point where it is quite likely that there will be essentially no shallow water coral left by mid-century. So, we have to do something that addresses both ends of the spectrum. And the problem is just how do you deal with human nature? Because human nature is to take the easy way out, right? And so even at the same time that, I mean, I worry about making a film about this. There's the moral hazard of the science itself, but if you make a film about this that's not sufficiently critical or analytical, do you just put the idea out there and platform the idea even more, right? Most people are not going to watch the full film. Most people might just hear about the fact that there's been a film about this idea that such and such. And so
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I think that's fairly accurate. And one thing that I came across in the film, and again, there's a lot of elements. There's a lot of very interesting people in the film. The scientists that we see, the back and forth at these conferences and in their meetings, internal meetings, is just utterly fascinating to me. But one thing that I assumed to be true, but this film brought it home in a more concrete way than I would have expected, and that is this is settled. We are heading towards something that may not be cataclysmic, but it will be world altering. The science seems settled that even if we start to do something tomorrow morning, it's possible we'll mitigate a lot of the damage and impact of it. But barring that, we're heading for some really dark times. And again, pump the brakes if you need to on this. But what I heard in those couple of meetings that we see in the film, that among the scientists, this is settled. I know there's a lot of
Yeah.
qualifications in what I just said.
No, I mean, I just want to be careful because I think one of the things that happens often is that we
Okay.
we end up in a place where we're just seeing, a very dark future.
Okay.
Um, and
Fair.
the sun will still shine in the future, right? It might be hotter, but yes, we're heading for a tremendous amount of change.
Okay. Fair.
And a lot of diversity is going to disappear. And things that we, you know, t- from a human perspective, in addition to just I mean, there's so many ways in which it's going to affect our lives. But one of the ways too is just like a fundamental reshaping of how the ways in which we go about our daily lives. Like I'm from New England and, things like cold winters and, maple syrup and beautiful fall foliage. I mean, a lot of the things that give people a sense of place, a sense of culture and tradition, like a lot of that is just going to change. And so there's really dramatic ways in which it will change, and there's really subtle ways in which it will change. And arguably the dramatic ones are much more important, and they also will primarily start to affect the global South and the world's poorest and developing nations the most. And those are the places that really need help, and they may be the places that actually kind of shout for solar geoengineering the loudest, and embrace it. But we don't know that. But I think what we can do now is stop denying what
There
we're
you go.
doing
There you go.
and start to figure out what we're going to do about it and try to use our brains instead of trying to score political points and drive people apart. I think the evidence is quite clear that most people agree that the planet is getting warmer and that the humans are driving that change. There are very small percentages, even in the US, of people who are completely in denial of that. They shout very loud, but the reality is, for a lot of people, the politics of it I think a lot of people have a hard time embracing the politics of the environmental movement. I think it feels like it's part of a tribal system of Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. And so, as much as I agree with a lot of the policy goals of the left, I think that we have to figure out how to speak to people in ways that don't alienate them and that give them a way into the conversation. And I mean, I'm very hopeful that this subject is actually, and that this story is one that can do that, because it is, it is a little bit different. It's looking at technology. It's talking about solutions, and not dwelling a lot on the kind of negative scenarios that we think a lot about. I mean, I think to me that's a given at this point. And so the question is, where do we find space to agree and move forward? Because yeah, there's a ton of change coming. Like I don't think we have any ability to fathom how much is coming, and how quickly. So it's more important that we figure out the right ways forward. And to me, science is a pretty important part of that.
Yeah, it really distresses me. It depresses me to see cheap political points made at the expense of solid science. When you denigrate science, vetted, the whole point of science is we get something wrong, we do our best to make it right, to figure it out. What did we get
Mhm.
wrong? Every day, scientists get up every day asking themselves those kinds of questions. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? Let's figure it out, and for them to be sort of political punching bags or with an agenda, with an internationalist agenda and all that kind of nonsense that you often hear, it's really upsetting to me because I don't know how to stop it. I don't know. But films like this, let's go back to Plan C for Civilization. This is a step in the right direction. People watch this film, you get all sides, you see the good, the bad, the warts and all in this film of the people who are deeply dedicated to doing what they believe to be the right things for all of us. And that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I kind of think about as I watch the film is that everyone that we interviewed for the film, they come from they really have a very, like you said, a really wide range of thinking about technology and solar geoengineering and really how we find the right path forward. But every single one of them is coming at it as somebody that understands and accepts what's happening, the reality around us, and is committed to figuring out how to solve the problem. And that's I think where we all need to be in order to solve this problem. And we can disagree about the trajectory and the tactics, the strategy, but let's at least get on the same page and row in the same direction.
Amen. Amen. Yeah. And I think you're right to mention that north-south divide where all of a sudden we're telling, countries of the southern hemisphere, well, you don't get all of the things that we've been doing for the last 75 years. You have to, there is that political kind of discontent. There's that sort of colonialism, if you will, in play. And again, it's something that's talked about in the film. Yeah, it's all here, and I'm so very happy for you. I want to once again mention that the film will get its world premiere screening at the Doc NYC Film Festival. That's Thursday, November 13th at 6:30 at Village East Angelica.
It's at the Village East, like by Angelica and
Oh, it
operating.
says by Angelica, yeah. So I'll do that again. Thursday, November 13th at 6:30, the Village East. Also on Saturday, November 15th at 1 o'clock at the Village East. And November 14th through the 30th, it's screening online through Doc NYC Film Festival. Ben Kalina, thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. I feel better. I'm worried, but I feel better. Having seen the film, it does give me some hope because people like David Keith and so many other people that are in this film deeply care about our future and are doing everything they can to make it better. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Thank you. You have been listening to Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar, the place where you will hear from the best in independent documentary and foreign filmmakers. Please check out our previous interviews as well as upcoming interviews and special programming by going to cinemaphilepod.com. We are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, searchable under Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar. Until next time, thank you for listening.